Hello, Solomon here, back with another video in my series on Tech 1 frigate fits for lowsec and faction warfare solo PvP. In this video I'm flying a beam executioner. I couldn't find that many recent executioner videos out there, so I thought it deserved some love. There are two excellent videos I'd recommend you watching, one by Blood Ruin and an older one by Cohagen. It was after watching Blood's video that I knew I wanted to fly the executioner at some point. I'm also recommending Ido's video if you're new to solo PvP. He expands to cover many of the mechanics, terminology and styles you need to be aware of when engaging in PvP. It's a great knowledge resource. I've linked both videos in the description here. So my fit doesn't differ too much from Blood's or Ido's in the way it's piloted. It's a scram kiter, which means you're fighting at the edge of scram range, between 7 and 10 kilometers. While essentially piloted the same way, I settled upon a slightly different fit. The executioner has the advantage of a high base speed but suffers from a relatively light tank. As I was trying out some different fits, it was very apparent how squishy this ship is. To compensate, I settled on a fit rigged for hull tanking and DPS. It was this fit that performed the best for me. 3 small focused Tech 2 beam lasers in the highs. With this fit coupled with my skills and the executioner's bonus to small energy turret damage, these lasers pump out over 180 DPS overheated. That's a good amount of pain to unleash on your opponent. Take a look at the range of these beams. They can apply optimal damage out to 8 kilometers, with a fall off range within 11 kilometers. It's within this range that you want to be fighting. Beam laser ships are not great brawlers due to their poor tracking. The best way to fly this ship in general is to set your keep at range distance between 7 and 10 kilometers. Fighting at this range is known as scram kiting, as you're engaging on the edge of warp scrambler range. You also want to try to keep a straight line between you and your opponent in order to apply your damage most effectively. If your opponent gets into a close orbit on you or is piloting in a way that increases their angular velocity, then your guns are going to have a hard time applying damage. In the mid slots I have a compact afterburner, Tech 2 web, and a faint epsilon scram. This is the meta scram with the greatest range. Fighting at the edge of scram, I want to have a scram that has the best possible reach to allow for some margin of error. Overheated, this meta scram gives me a 9.9 kilometer range. In the lows, a compact DCU, Tech 2 heatsink for extra DPS and an Ansel armor rep. Since I'm not flying with any fitting implants here, the reason for the meta damage control is so that I can fit the Tech 2 web. You could fit a Tech 2 DC here and meta down the web. While the Tech 2 damage control would increase my overall HP, my reasoning for choosing a Tech 2 web over the Tech 2 damage control in this particular fit is that the Tech 2 web has a 60% velocity dampener effect compared to 55% for the other Tech 1 webs. I want to get into my optimal range as fast as possible. The Tech 2 web was important here, slowing my opponent's ship down that little bit more, allowing me to reach my optimal fighting range a little bit faster. As mentioned, in the rig slots I went for 2 small bulkhead rigs and a damage rig. My advice would be to always fit at least 1 damage rig. Without it, your DPS isn't really high enough to mitigate for the relatively weak tank of the executioner. With this fit and my skills, I'm getting 184 DPS heated from the lasers and 2800 effective hit points. It's a reasonable balance between DPS and tank. A quick mention on the ammo I carry. Default ammo will be Imperial Navy multi-frequency. It applies the most damage within your optimal fighting range. I'm also packing Navy X-Ray, Navy Standard and the Tech 2 variant Aurora. In practice, with the exception of Aurora, I hardly ever used them. They are mainly there to allow me the option of choosing different fighting ranges while applying reasonable damage. Each crystal set affects your DPS and optimal range. Let's take a look in EFT. If you're not familiar with EFT, it stands for E-Fitting Tool and is a great out-of-game tool for testing ship fits and sizing them up against potential opponents. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to be being updated any longer, which is a real shame, but there are other out-of-game fitting tools that get good reviews. I go over EFT in more detail in my previous Atron videos, so if you're new to EFT, I recommend watching those. With Navy multi-frequency, I'm getting 8.3 km optimal on 184 DPS. Swapping to Navy X-Ray, my optimal range increases to 12 kilometers while DPS decreases to 154. With Navy Standard, it's 17 kilometer optimal range with 123 DPS. With Aurora, you're getting a massive 30 km optimal range, but your DPS drops to 107. Also, Aurora has a 75% reduced tracking speed penalty on top. A couple of reasons why you would want to be using these crystals are: 1. Your opponent is pulling range on you outside of the reach of your navy multi-frequency. Swapping crystals will keep the damage flowing. 2. You want to begin a fight against a particularly tough opponent at a greater range to soften them up a bit before swapping to multi-frequency to finish the job. Or 3. You are engaging a kitey ship already at its established orbit, usually around 20 to 25 kilometers here. It can be useful on occasions to have this versatility in applying damage at different ranges. It's one of the strengths of laser ships. Okay, let's get into some fights. First up is a fight with another executioner. You'll notice I have my mid slots all overheated here. I've met a few kiting executioners recently which got the better of me in pulled range. If this turns out to be a micro warp drive kite fit, then I want to pounce on it as fast as I can and not let it get the opportunity to pull range. Kiting ships entering a faction warfare plex will try and burst their micro warp drive so that they get up enough speed that even if they do get scrammed, their initial momentum will carry them out of scram range enough to reactivate their prop mod. As soon as I see him on the overview, I spam the approach command and burn at him with overheated AB. As soon as I have him scrammed, I spam the keep at range command, which has been set to 8.5 kilometers. I quickly change my fighting distance to a closer range. 8.5 kilometers is right at the edge of my scram. There is a chance that your opponent can slip out of your scram range and escape. Watch the damage notifications as my momentum carries me out to 7,000 meters. This executioner is fit with pulse lasers. Pulse lasers dish out similar DPS, but they don't have the same reach as beams. At this range they are doing little damage to me while my beams are delivering hits and smashes. The fight is won. Let's go back to AFT to compare the two ships and see the difference in weapon systems. When learning PvP, I can't recommend out-of-game fitting tools like this enough. They are so useful in getting to know your ship and fit and how to fly it against others. On the left is my opponent's executioner with pulse lasers, and on the right my own fit with beams. Looking at the DPS of both ships, we see the pulse lasers 172 compared to the beams at 184. Not much in it. The significant difference is the range. With pulse lasers fitted, my opponent has a 4 km optimal range with navy multi-frequency. Now check out the range on the beam lasers. Just over 8 kilometers. So how does this affect damage application and fight tactics? Let's open the DPS graph and compare both ships. At a range of 4 kilometers, the pulse lasers are applying good damage, around 170 DPS. But notice how the DPS falls off as we move outside this range. 153 DPS at 5 kilometers, dropping drastically to mid-40s at 7.5 kilometers. Let's compare that figure at the same distance with the beams. 187 DPS with the beams at 7.5 kilometers, with room to spare. Comparing these two fits, we can understand that we need to be fighting our opponent 2 or 3 kilometers outside the range of his guns. As I pulled away past 4 kilometers from my opponent, his DPS drops while mine maintains constant. At 7 kilometers he's doing very little damage and I'm catching more reps as a result. As the gap closes again, he begins to get better hits on me, but it's too little too late and I win the race. I see a Kestrel at a novice faction warfare plex. There's a good possibility it could be dual web fit, which could be bad for me. Kestrels are pretty slow, but if he's dual webbed he will be slightly faster. Not by much though. If he's sitting on the warp end beacon and gets a tight orbit on me, my guns will have trouble tracking him. The plan is to enter the plex and kick on my AB as soon as possible, and to pull as much range before he webs me. This will put some distance between us and allow my guns to track better as he's chasing to catch up. As I land, I see him some 11 kilometers away, not where I would be if you're dual web fit. It turns out to be single web shield fit, also common in lowsec faction warfare space. I give chase. I derp around a bit with my web and scram in this fight, accidentally double clicking my web which turns it off after one cycle. As a result he pulls away, outside the range of my lasers, and I miss him a couple of times. I eventually stop derping around and get things back under some sort of control. I included this fight to demonstrate the good reach and DPS of beam lasers. With my mistakes at the beginning of this fight, I am forced to engage at a greater range than preferable. Yet even at outside optimal range, the beams were still able to apply enough damage to keep my head in the fight. Another Kestrel to fight. This one turns out to be dual webbed and armour tanked. He lands about 6 kilometers away and I start the burn to my scram kiting range while locking him up. I get the lock on first and start to apply some initial DPS. Rolling over the web icon above my HUD tells me he is dual webbed. Kestrels are pretty slow, but if he's dual webbed he will be slightly faster. With its 60% damp on speed, the Tech 2 web really helps in this fight. He is gaining on me though, and I'm a little concerned about him establishing an orbit which will hurt the tracking on my lasers. I select a 10 kilometer keep at range distance, which seems to have the effect of straightening out my ship a little and quite possibly helping my guns to track better. A super close fight, his dying volley of rockets taking me to the brink of death. The T2 web and most definitely the hull tank played a big part in this fight. Without the hull tanking rigs, I'm pretty sure I would have died. The dual web armour Kestrel is a formidable ship, and I have a breakdown video on this fit on my channel for anyone interested. The next fight I want to demonstrate is against a dual rep breacher, another formidable ship in faction warfare lowsec, and which was the subject of my most recent video. Notice I have set myself up some 10 kilometers away from the warp in beacon. This beacon is the point where all ships land within a faction warfare plex. These dual rep breachers have a super tank, and I simply won't win a DPS race with them fighting within the range of their rockets. Breachers don't have any bonus to rocket range. Knowing this, I plan to start the fight outside his rocket range, which is about 10 kilometers. This is where carrying a selection of different laser crystals is really useful. At 10 plus kilometers my lasers won't reach with multi-frequency, so you'll notice I swapped to Navy X-ray. Navy X-ray give me an optimal range of 12 kilometers while still applying good DPS. As he comes in, I kick on my afterburner and spam my keep it range, which I've set to 12 kilometers. My lasers get to work on his shields and his drones start to work on me. As my ship flies out of the set 12 kilometer range, it turns back in on itself to re-establish this range. In doing so, the gap closes and I get a strike from his rockets. As my ship turns around again attempting to regain its set range, I'm now burning away from his rockets, and thus they have to spend a longer time trying to reach me. It's hard to see here, but if you look closely, you can see their little yellow dots approach and fizzle out as their flight time expires. He's being repping hard now and using up his charges. It's time to change it up a gear. I choose a new keep of range distance and swap my X-ray crystals to multi-frequency. At this range I'll be applying max damage with the hope that he's pretty much out of rep charges. Up success. What a good fight. Hull tank rigs for the win here again. Up next we have a fight against a Merlin. I'm putting this in the video as an example of a weapon system to avoid fighting in this fit, or at least be very careful of. Merlins typically come in two versions, blaster fit or rails, and often with dual webs. Both are pretty dangerous, but it is rails in particular that are a bad matchup for this fit. This Merlin turned out to be fit with 150mm railguns. In my head I had set up to fight one with blasters. I have my keep it range set to 11 kilometers and start the burn as soon as he lands. If he was dual web blaster fit, he's going to have a considerable distance to catch me before his short range blasters can start applying damage, and I would probably win the DPS race by applying more initial damage to him before he can to me. As you can see though, he's smacking me hard from 9 kilometers away. Rails project very well, easily into 9 kilometers and beyond. What you really want to do with rail fits is orbit them tight as they have poor tracking. But orbiting in a beam laser ship isn't going to do you any favours either, as beams track poorly. I should have tried maybe, but the fight was over in 30 seconds. I was pretty much locked into my chosen tactic here. Watch out for railguns in this fit. Comets are tough fights in this fit. Tough fights in any T1 frigate to be honest. Stay away from real comets with this fit, they're just going to wreck you. Blaster fit comets, however, you can manage with a little practice. Because blasters are short range weapons, you can use the scram kiting abilities of this fit to pilot outside, or at least at the very edge of, blaster fall off, and therefore mitigating much of the incoming damage. Some Z-kill research told me this pilot was probably blaster fit. As he lands, I spam the keep at range command, which I've set to 8.5 kilometers, at the very edge of scram range, and where his blasters are going to have trouble reaching. You can see from the damage notifications that his guns are missing me completely. This would indicate he is either void or antimatter loaded in his guns. Null should have been his choice ammo here. The fight is going really well for me, but at over 9,000 meters my beams aren't applying as well as they could, so I changed my keep it range to 7,500 meters. I had stopped overheating my afterburner because I didn't want it to burn out, but he's overheating his and pulling away. I overheat my AB again for one cycle. He's out of scram and web range but comes back in again and I quickly reapply, but in my scramble to manage my modules in this fight I have forgotten to watch the heat on my guns and they burn out. Incredibly annoying, as he was in about 5% structure I reckon. One more shot and I may have had him. Third parties arrive and it's time to take my leave. Nothing more I can do now anyway. At over a minute this was a long tough fight for a Tech 1 frigate. Expect this when fighting Navy Comets with this fit. Looking back at the kill mail, I chewed through just under 6,000 hit points on his Comet. Compare that to my total hit points of 2,800. The Executioner held up well against a superior hull, and this was a good demonstration of its scram kiting and DPS projection capabilities. If I had managed my heat better, I would have come away with a nice kill. Sad face. This is a nice fight against a dual rep Autocannon Slasher. Slashers are pretty squishy, but they can be dangerous against laser ships. What you got to plan for is tracking disruptors and speed. Slashers are fast and are often fit with tracking disruptors, which are loaded with scripts that will either close down the optimal range of your guns, forcing you to fight closer, or disrupt their tracking. The Slasher will be faster than me, and if I allow him to get into a close orbit around me, I'm not going to do well. This fight demonstrates a piloting technique to counter a fast ship getting into an orbit around you, which is going to throw your DPS. Anticipating I may be coming up against an optimal range disrupting fit, I switched to Navy Crystals, giving me extra reach to counter any disruption. The Slasher's on the gate, and with another war targeting system I decide not to engage here but take the gate into the combat plex. Any help he may have coming will have to warp to the gate first, giving me a few extra seconds to fight the Slasher. As I land I'm checking D-scan for any other ships coming. It's looking pretty clear and the fight is on. As he lands I choose a keep it range distance of 15 kilometers. He's going to be fast, so I wanted to pull as much range as possible within the optimal range of my guns. My first few volleys take him into deep armour, and the icons above the HUD show that I'm not disrupted. I switch my keep it range to 8,500 meters and swap to Navy multi-frequency crystals for max DPS. Now in doing this, he gets a lot closer, and you'll start to see him establishing an orbit. His guns are delivering some good damage now, and I try to increase my range from him. But he's a good bit faster, and you can see him swinging into an orbit and my lasers actually miss a few times. I change tactic. I hit the approach command to turn my ship around, and then as he flies past me I double click in space to stop the approach and spam the keep it range command again. What's happened here is that I've effectively slingshotted him, and we're now both moving away from each other at speed. With his orbit broken, my guns can track better. I get capped out for a moment here, but there was enough cap regen to re-engage the lasers. 2 more volleys and he's done. Great fight. Again, the hull tank was the star of the show here, I think. Next up is a fight against a Rifter. Rifters get a bad press, but despite their reputation, they are pretty decent brawlers with the right fit. It will be interesting to see what fits come out of the upcoming balance update, which is swapping the current utility high slot to an additional low slot. I included this fight as it's another good example of the scram kiting and DPS projection ability of the Executioner. Rifters get a bonus to damage and fall off, so in this fight I'm going to be fighting at the extreme end of his fall off here. As he appears on grid, I do the usual sequence of events first. Activate my overheated prop mod, spam the keep it range command, which I've set to 9,000 meters in this case, and lock him up. By the time the fight starts, I'm at my optimal range, deep within the fall off of his guns. This is a dual armor rep Rifter, sacrificing a web for a second armor repper. With no web on me, I have range control here, and it's just a matter of chewing through his dual reps. It's a nice fit, and fairly tanky once those dual reps kick in. About now is when he's out of nanite paste for his ancillary armor repper. Once that goes, he just doesn't have the repping power against my lasers, and he pops shortly after. A nice fight. Last fight for this video is against a 420 million kite-fit Garmur. The current mechanics of a faction warfare plex mean that catching a Garmur warping into is a real possibility, if you play it right. Remember, all ships entering a novice, small or medium faction warfare plex land at a beacon. I've set myself up some 6 kilometers from this beacon. What the Garmur will want to be doing is activating his overheated micro warp drive and burning away from me as fast as possible, so that even in the event of me getting a scram on him and shutting off his MWD, his initial burst of speed will carry him outside my scram range where he can activate it again and pull range. If this happens, I'm dead. This Garmur fit can do 7 kilometers per second overheated. It's frighteningly fast. I have my afterburner scram and web overheated here to get the maximum speed and scram range possible. As soon as he appears in the overview, I kick on my afterburner, spam the approach button and lock him up. Watch his speed and distance on my overview. He rockets from a standing start to 4,500 meters per second before I lock him and get the scram on. His inertia carries him 10 kilometers away from me at the extreme edge of my overheated scram, but my scram held and I have him. The damage projection of my lasers already getting to work. The fight is over in seconds and a 420 million pirate frigate is rapidly disassembled by a 10 million Tech 1 frigate. I love it. So that wraps it up for this video. Those were some of the nice fights I got into in this executioner. I recorded many more fights, both wins and losses, which I've put in a playlist and linked in the information below. Thanks for watching, and I hope you got something out of it. If you like what I'm doing here, please subscribe to my channel for continuing videos in the series. Fly brave out there.